What I want to do here is, to some degree, abstract and philosophical. I think in a good way. Um, Mark, are we recording?
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay, we are recording. Okay, I see that.
recording.
Okay, so I want to split the shiur today and next week into two shiurim. I could rush the material and push it together into one shiur, but I think it's better to try to separate them and tackle the two different ideas separately, and this together with next week and with last week's shiur might actually be a reasonable set of the essentials of the introduction to Jewish philosophy. This is really a shiur for Shavuot. It's not about Parshat Bamidbar. It's a shiur for Shavuot. And I was preparing the Kriyat Torah for Shavuot and looking at the Aseret HaDibrot and thinking about the differences between the Aseret HaDibrot in Yitro, which we'll read on Shavuot, and the reading on Ve'et Chanan, which is Moshe apparently relating to Bnei Israel in his dramatic speech in Avot Moav, a paraphrase of the original. And there are many differences between the first Aseret HaDibrot and the second. The most famous of which, I think, is Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadisho. The language there in Parshat Ve'et Chanan is Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadisho. Of course, I'm going to share with you the texts, but I want to talk about the fact that they are so very different. Chazal famously say, Echad something, Shnaim Zo Shamati. The events of Har Sinai, where two things were said, but were heard simultaneously as one, or one voice split into two hearings. The whole event of Matan Torah on Har Sinai is somewhat above the world of the physics as we know it. And that really shouldn't surprise us. The way when you have a commingling of the physical world and the transcendent, the normal rules cannot possibly apply. The psukim themselves say, ro'im et hakolot. They saw the sounds. When you hear something like that, you know that you're dealing with a reality that doesn't conform to what we live in our daily lives. I want to play with the focus here. This is okay. I made it worse. Okay. I made it much worse. There we go. Oh, it's a little bit better. Maybe it's not. Okay. So the Parshanim deal with the question of how it is we can have Zachor and Shamor. And many drashot have been given as to how those are two concepts that are actually complementing each other. That, of course, in Shabbat, we have the mitzvot taseh and the mitzvot lo taseh. We have the different aspects of Shabbat, and they come together, and they are encompassed in either Zachor and Shamor. Every bit of that is true. The people who deal with biblical criticism, I sympathize for what they're trying to do. I have little sympathy for their output, but they're dealing with difficult questions of texts that seem not to work well together. So some have suggested, and I think we're going to see in today's shiur that it's kind of ludicrous, that, well, Shmot and Dvarim had different authors. We don't need to go there. I think we can give perfectly good explanations. Both Rambam and Ramban grapple with the question of how it is that these texts are not the same. One says Zachor, one says Shamor, describing the exact same event. They do not bring the drashot of Chazal, of Shamor v'Zachor v'Dibur Echad. They deal with the fundamental question of what is the relationship between Zachor and Shamor. And I want to bring both Rambam and Ramban in their own words. So let's, Mark, you got to let me do this. Give me back screen sharing. Mark, you there?
Yeah, I am. You've been able to the last few times. I'm not sure what's different.
I don't know. You have to undisable. You don't have to, but it's easier.
So look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you the host, and then I think you'll be able to share your screen. It'll also mean that you can mute people.
Oh, good.
I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that.
Where are we? PDF. Here we go. Okay. So in Parshat Yitro and Sefer Shmot, the reading for Shavuot, Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadisho. Why do we say keep Shabbat? Ki, right? That's causative. Ki sheshet yamim asar Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz et hayam ekol shabam vayanach bayom hashvi'i al ken ve'irach Adonai yom haShabbat vayikadeshehu. Why are we keeping Shabbat? This simple, maybe simplistic explanation is because God did. Let's agree that that's oversimplified. Okay. In Dvarim, it opens with Shamor. I don't want to focus on the Shamor part. I want to focus more on the key. V'zacharta. There's no key sheishet yamim. That clause is missing. After the pasuk saying that you need to rest, and your children, and your slaves, and your animals, and your gerim, v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim v'yotziach Adonai Elohecha misham biyad chazaka u'b'zroa netuya al kain tzivecha Adonai Elohecha lasot et yom HaShabbat. Why do we keep Shabbat according to Vet Hanan? Because you were slaves and God freed you from slavery. That's a significant difference. What's happening here? We need to try to understand what is the real reason, the real reasons that we're keeping Shabbat. The Psukim tell us it's either because God created the heavens and earth and then rested, or perhaps it's because we were slaves in Egypt and God liberated us. And the easy answer is both. Okay, I have no problem with both. Ramban actually does, but let's say both. Rambam in Musar-Avicha devotes one whole chapter, a short chapter, to this question, and I want to learn the chapter in its entirety because there's some important points there, some seriously important points. And then we'll see the Ramban's rejoinder, and we'll be able to see how they agree and they disagree. And I think these are central issues to philosophy. Rambam, this is the second section of the Musar-Avicha. The previous chapters we're dealing with the creation of the world and Rambam's explication of the psukim in the opening chapters of Sefer Bereshit, explaining in a rationalist way the creation of the world. That's fine. And like the Torah itself, once you've created the world, you arrive at Shabbat. So Rambam has arrived at Shabbat. Ulai kvar, you know what? I like this text better. Actually, that's not fair. It's not fair for me to use different text than the one I put on the screen. Ulai kvar hitba'ara lecha ha'ila bechozek Torat HaShabbat v'hiyota b'skila. No, I can't do this. I'm sorry. The text you have on the screen is kapach, and no, it's not a good text. I want to use the new translation from the Machon Moshe, Mifal Mishneh Torah, from Yochai Makbili, the actual translations from Hillel Gershuni. 2/3 of it has already been published. Obviously, this chapter is here. אפשר שהתפאר לך כבר הטעם לכך שמצוות השבת הודגשה ושהיא בסגילה ושאדון הנביאים הרג עליה. I suppose, says the Rambam, that you've already figured out the reason why Shabbat is so central to our philosophy, to the extent that a violation of Shabbat requires execution by stoning, and that Adon HaNevi'im, that's Moshe Rabbeinu, executed the Mikoshesh Eitzim at the end of Parshat Shlach, because it is so central to our philosophy that if someone violates Shabbat, he is executed. And then Rambam, now we get to the important part. That was just an introduction. V'shehi shlishit, rak lemitziut ha'eloah v'shlilat shniyut. The mitzvah of Shabbat is the third most important axiom of Judaism. Okay, how does he say it here? Shlishit lemitziut ha'eloah v'harchakat shniyut. Okay, very similar. It is third only in the list of important mitzvot to the very existence of God and the rejection of any plurality of God. I'll word it ever so slightly differently. Judaism believes that God is unique. That is the actual text of Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Echad means unique, and I don't care what the translation you said it is. Go take a pen and change it. Echad means unique. Unique in the truest sense, the way it means correctly in the language, as opposed to the way it's used today to mean anything that is vaguely special, and people say very unique or silly things like that. Unique in the absolutist sense, there is nothing that can even remotely be compared, because the very act of comparison implies that they might have some relationship. So our basic axioms of the Jewish faith are the existence of God, his uniqueness, and therefore indivisibility and non-compete and all those other things that go with it, and then Shabbat. Well, that doesn't really work. What do you mean, and then Shabbat? Is Shabbat really number 3? No. Rambam is going to explain. Ukvari adata midvarai, he's talking to his student here. In the case of, we're reading Moreh Nevuchim, we can assume the role of the student, but this is actually being written to a specific student. Ukvari adata midvarai shahdeot. אם לא יהיו להם מעשים שיעמדום ויפרסמום ויתמידום בהמון לנצח, לא יישארו. This is a seminal sentence in Rambam's philosophy. We'll talk about this more next week, but in the question of why mitzvot, Says Rambam, the abstract ideas that create religion only stand up the test of time if they are tied to acts that will establish them and publicize them and create permanence among the people. And in the absence of tying an idea to an act, it will all be lost. And in point of fact, Rambam himself explains in the beginning of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, when talking about the experience of Avraham Avinu, and he talks about how Avraham, at the time, Avram derived on his own the concept of God and the unique indivisibility of God, and God as the creator. And he spread the faith of God and the falsehood of idolatry and paganism. And he had followers, and it was all lost. And why was it all lost? That Rambam doesn't say over there in Hilchot Avodah Zarah. He simply documents how it was all lost until comes Moshe Rabbeinu, and he reestablishes these philosophical ideas and brings down the mitzvot. Here, Rambam says it overtly. Why mitzvot? Because ideas need to be tied to acts. Vilazeh, and therefore, tzivanu b'Torah lahagdil zeh hayom ad sheyitkayem yesod chidush ha'olam v'yitparsem b'mitziut כשישפטו בני אדם כולם ביום אחד וכשישאל מה על עילת זה. Therefore, says the Rambam, the Torah commands us Shabbat. Why Shabbat? To establish the principle that God created the world. This is principle number 3. There is a God who is unique, and he created the world. Shabbat is nothing less, and to a large degree, nothing more than simply publicizing and reminding ourselves over and over again, God created the world. And a man should ask himself, when he is sitting on Shabbat, suspended from labor, like God himself suspended from labor, why am I doing this? The answer is, and when we say, a man asks himself, why am I doing this? We can think of the 4 sons in the Haggadah, the Chacham, who says, what's the deep meaning here? The Rasha, who says, oof, why am I keeping Shabbat? And the Tam, who says, what? And the Sheino Yudai Lishol, who doesn't know he's supposed to ask. And unfortunately, so many of us don't realize that we need to ask. We'll talk a lot more about this next week. We need to ask. We need to ask ourselves, why am I doing this mitzvah? And each one will get an answer at his level. But the answer for Shabbat is because God created the world. And why do I need to know this? You need to know this because it's a central element of the faith, that there is a God and he created the world. Let's take a step back and look at the Aseret HaDibrot, is where we started. Let's look at the structure of the Aseret HaDibrot and what the Rambam is telling us here. The first command, the first davar in the Aseret HaDibrot is Anochi. There is a God. The second and the third, which go together, Lo yelecha Elohim acharim apanai, and Lo tisa Shem Hashem Elokecha lashav. Rambam explains, it's not Rambam, it's all of Chazal. They explain, what's this Lo tisa Shem Hashem Elokecha lashav is, Unfortunately, it's translated, you shall not take God's name in vain. Lahalacha, what it means is that, among other things, you may not take a vow in the name of any other God. And you could see in a society, in a mixed society, we had Jews living with pagans. A Jew might want to emphasize a vow that he is taking, or a contract that he is going to uphold. And yeah, I'll swear in the name of your God too. But that's a complete violation of the uniqueness of God. You can't entertain the possibility of being another God. So we have Anochi, and then we have the set of Lo Yeh Lecha and Lo Tisa. And if you think I'm oversimplifying, please allow me to read to you from Rambam, again, Mor Nevuchim. This is section 2, chapter 13. Zohi efo achat hadayot, v'hi b'li safek yesod b'torat Moshe Rabbeinu, v'hu sheni liyesod hayichud. This is number 2 in the axiomatic, the seminal axioms that are Judaism. And what is this? Don't consider the possibility otherwise. And what is it? Avraham Avinu hitchil lefarsem et hadaya azot she'ha'iyun hovil oto eleha, ולכן הוא היה קורא בשם אדוני אל עולם, הוא הביע דעה זו במפורש בדבריו קונה שמיים וארץ. Rambam, here in the Morah, he's saying, Yesod number 2 is that God created the world. Because the other one, the second clauses of the Aseret HaDibrot are negative things. And the seminal axioms of Judaism are positive things. So number 2 is actually, there is a unique God as one. There is a unique God with its derivatives that you cannot have another God. And number 2, who created the heavens and the earth. Says Rambam, V'hu sheni liyesod hayichud. The quote that Rambam associates to Avram here, B'Shem Adonai El Olam, it's from Parshat Vayera. Rambam uses that sentence as his opening sentence, preface if you prefer, to every single major book he wrote, and in the Morah, to each, as the opening of each of the 3 sections of the Morah, he has B'Shem Adonai El Olam. For Rambam, this is the essential pasuk, because it includes the existence of God, B'Shem Adonai, and El Olam, creator, master of the universe. So in those 4 words, B'Shem Adonai El Olam, for Rambam, you have the distillation of the whole philosophy in 4 words. And he uses it as the introduction to every one of his works. Okay. וכבר בא בזו מצווה שני עילות מתחלפות מפני שהם לשני עילולים מתחלפים, וזהו שאמר בעילת הגדיל השבת ב10 הדיברות. I really want to go back to the other translation. למצווה זו הובאו שני טעמים שונים. This makes so much more sense. משום שהם לשני עניינים שונים. In point of fact, we already saw that Sefer Dvarim has a different reason for Shabbat. Yitziat Mitzrayim. You just said that why Shabbat? Because it is this central element of a philosophy, second only to the existence of God himself. But there's a second reason. בטעם השבת שנאמר ב10 הדיברות הראשונות, כי 6 ימים, ובמשנה תורה דעת ספר דברים, נאמר וזכרת כי יוודעת בארץ מצרים, ויוציאך אדוני אלוהיך משם ביד חזרה ובזרוע נטויה, על כן ציווך אדוני אלוהיך לעשות את יום השבת. וזה נכון. Says Rambam, it's good that we were given 2 reasons. Why? כי הדבר שניתן לאותם באמירה הראשונה הוא כיבוד יום השבת וחשיבותו. The first reason is why we have this important day and we need to honor it. על כן בירך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו. זה מה שנובע מהטעם כששת ימים. ואילו העובדה שקיבלנו זאת כמצווה ונצטווינו לשמור אותו אנחנו, נובעת מן הטעם שהיינו עבדים במצרים, שלא עבדנו מרצוננו החופשי, ומתי שחפצנו ולא יכולנו לשבות. When we were slaves in Egypt, we are not masters, slaves are not masters of their time. So while it's true that Shabbat establishes the principle of God as the divine creator, and you might say, what is that to me? Why is that a reason for me not to work on Shabbat? So the answer is because God taught you an important lesson when he took you out of slavery. He gives you the ability to be the master of your own time. Al kain nitztavenu lishbot v'lanuach kedei letzaref et shnei advarim, to combine these two elements. Ha'emunah b'de'ah nechona v'hi chidush ha'olam hamoreh b'mabad rishon u'v'yun kal al kiyum eHaloah v'zchirat chesed Hashem eleinu וכך ששחרר אותנו מתחת סבלות מצרים, והרי זה חסד הכולל העמדת דעה עיונית נכונה ותיקון המצב הגופני. Says Rambam, indeed, there are two distinct reasons for keeping Shabbat. One is a philosophical idea. They're both philosophical ideas. One is a philosophical idea of God as the creator of the world. And from there, it is a very easy philosophical idea to, if God created the world, then in fact, he is God. That's almost a syllogism. And the second, that Bnei Israel, having been liberated from slavery and become master of their time, have been given the ultimate gift by God. And we commemorate this and we renew our understanding of this when we keep Shabbat. So says Rambam. Okay, so there are two ideas. And therefore, there are two different expressions in the Aseret HaDibrot, two very central ideas, perhaps one more important than the other. And therefore, we have two separate expressions in the Aseret HaDibrot. Rambam is not pleased. Ramban is not pleased. Let's look at the Ramban. Ramban in Sefer Dvarim, when we get to the second version of the Dibrot, and it's different, Ramban needs to explain why it is different. So first he quotes Ibn Ezra and rejects him. That's fine. And then he quotes basically much of that chapter in Mor Nevuchim, a different translation, obviously, he's working from, and he's not happy with it. Now, he's not disagreeing with it, because how could you possibly disagree? But he's saying, it's not clear to me. He's not outright rejecting it, but it's not clear to him. Why? Kiviyotenu shovtim, when we are refraining from labor on Shabbat, v'lo na'aseh melacha b'yom hashvi'i, ein lanu b'zeh zikaron liyetziat Mitzrayim, ve'ein l'ro'eh otanu b'telim mimelacha yedi'ah b'zeh rak ki k'shar kol ha'mitzvot. Says Ramban, the act of non-labor, there's not a lot to see there, right? When someone is not doing melachot on Shabbat, it's kind of hard to look at him and say, see, that man, I see what he's doing. And what is he doing? Nothing. So it's hard, says the Ramban, to look at it and say, a man is sitting and doing nothing. That reminds me of Yetziat Mitzrayim. A man is sitting doing nothing. That reminds me of the creation. No, But you could say that in the imitation of God, who, as it were, rested on the seventh day, so too we rest on the seventh day. But certainly that's not a central element of our faith, the way Ramban sees it. And it's not overt. And I think for Ramban, something else is bothering him much more. Ramban wants to look at these two different reasons for keeping Shabbat, and he wants to find a common denominator. There needs to be a common element. There has to be something about God having created the world and God having brought us out of Mitzrayim that overlaps. How can we have two separate reasons for keeping Shabbat and they have nothing to do with each other other than the fact that God said them both? It doesn't make sense, says Ramban. They need to come together in some way. So he's going to give an explanation. כי בעבור היות יציאת מצרים מורה על הלא הקדמון מחדש חפץ ויכול, כאשר פירשתי בדיבור ראשון, על כן אמר בכאן, אם יעלה בלבך ספק על שבת, המורה על חידוש והחפץ ויכולת, תזכור מה שראו עיניך ביציאת מצרים, שהיא לך לראייה לזכר, הנה השבת זכר ליציאת מצרים, ויציאת מצרים זכר לשבת. Whoa, we're starting to get into circular logic. But no, there's a method to the madness. Shabbat reminds you of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and Yetziat Mitzrayim reminds you of Shabbat. And that's why we have to keep Shabbat. We need to understand what Ramban is saying. I'll tell you what Ramban is saying. What Ramban is saying is that, how am I going to word this? What Ramban is saying is that through the keeping of Shabbat, you see God. And through the memory of Yetziat Mitzrayim, you see God. And that's the common element. Ramban is doing something that is almost the absolute opposite of what Rambam did. Ramban is saying, I see God through Shabbat. I see God through Yetziat Mitzrayim. Therefore, they share common elements, common ideas. And therefore, it's justifiable that in Yitro and Vet Hanan, we have these two different concepts that overlap. Ramban goes so far as to say that in his Parshat Torah on Parshat Yitro, I'll give it to you. He says, where are we? Here. No, sorry. Let's go down. Ramban on Sefer Yitro, on Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotziticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Asher Hotziticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Ki Hotziam Misham Toreh, Ki Hotzaatam Misham Toreh, Al HaMitziut V'al HaChefetz. That's exactly what he said in Vet Hanan about the creation of the world. One second. You're not seeing it. Hold on. I'm sorry. Here we go. He used that exact same phrase, that Toreh al hamitziut v'al hachefetz. The fact that we look at Shabbat and that reminds us of the creation of the world. It reminds us of God, who is omnipotent and omniscient. So too, for the generation that left Mitzrayim, right? You people, right? Who is he saying? Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. To the people who a mere 2 months earlier had left Mitzrayim. So for them, Mitzrayim is a personal memory. And you know that it was God. It says, Vayiminu b'Hashem Moshe Avdo. They remember and they recognize and they acknowledge that it was God himself who brought them out of Mitzrayim, not Moshe. God himself brought them out of Mitzrayim, and that was very real and tangible for them. So too, the Shabbat is real and tangible for you to remind you that God created the world. That's what the Rambam is saying here. That's what the Ramban is saying here. For Ramban, what is the linkage? That both Shabbat and Yetziat Mitzrayim are the way to discover God, to uncover God, to find God, to remember God. And therefore, it is completely reasonable that two different expressions are used to justify, to explain the need for Shabbat. Rambam obviously is very different. For Rambam, he doesn't need to play this game that the reasons for Shabbat need to overlap and communicate with each other. It's sufficient that we have one central idea and we have a secondary idea, which is also important and directly related to the Shabbat. And therefore, we can look at Yetziat Mitzrayim and remember our debt to God for having given us the freedom to be masters of our own time. But more importantly, Shabbat is the tool to remind ourselves on an ongoing basis of God as the creator. And as such, we can also go back to the idea that we started with. Every mitzvah, every abstract idea needs to be attached to a mitzvah in order for it to survive as a viable philosophy. So Rambam has done some very important things here. I think the key words in the Rambam, let's go back up. This is so important that we need to go back to it. An idea that is not an idea, a concept that is not tied to an act will be lost. And for Rambam, that concept underlies many, many of the mitzvot. And what I want to do next week, I want to devote an entire separate shiur to that idea, and to focus on the first of the dibrot and the most central. If we start with in the Sefer Mitzvot and go quickly through the mitzvot as the Rambam presents them, we'll see how the Rambam explains the reasoning behind the mitzvot. In effect, what I'm as a promo for next week's shiur, we're going to see that what absolutely everyone thinks, and I do mean everyone, what everyone thinks the Rambam is doing with his Tamei HaMitzvot is simply false. And what I want to show you is how they came to that idea, why it's incorrect, what the Rambam really meant by the Tamei HaMitzvot, and how that affects our lives. And I mean that very seriously, how it affects our lives and our Kiyum HaMitzvot and our whole approach to philosophy. Okay? So Mirz Hashem will do that next week. So overview, what did we do today? the Aseret HaDibrot talks about Shabbat, gives two explanations of why we keep Shabbat. Rambam explains the important one is that Shabbat is the physical manifestation of our belief that God created the world. And because God created the world and then stopped when he saw that the creation was perfected, it's a separate discussion, but let's just a regular chat. When it says that God saw that the work was finished, what does it mean? Is the work ever finished? We're not talking about Aristotle's God who walked away. We're talking about God who's still involved in history. So what does it mean to say that God finished? It means that God can acknowledge that the work that he performed was fruitful, that all the material that is necessary for the ongoing survival of the world is there. That doesn't mean that there won't be future interventions or corrections, but not many and not overt. And we too need to take a step back from our labors to look at them and say, good enough. I am no longer going to be creative. For the next 25 hours, I will step away from my labors and enjoy and contemplate the fruit of those labors, just like God did. So for Rambam, that is the command of Shabbat. Unlike Ramban, who said we look at Shabbat and see God, Rambam basically says we see God as the creator and therefore have Shabbat. Now, I don't think Rambam disagrees with Ramban, and Ramban, I don't think, disagrees with Rambam. They're approaching the same thing from opposite directions. I have my own opinion, but they're not necessarily disagreeing. It's a question of perspective. And Rambam looks at Shabbat as an expression of an acknowledgement of God as the creator of the world. And that, for the Rambam, is the tam of the mitzvah. Why do we keep Shabbat? Because God is the creator of the world. But not because, on a flat sense, we need to delve deeper. We need to say to ourselves, because in the sense of we need to keep Shabbat because God created the world. And then we need to sit down and think, what does it mean that God created the world? What does it mean when we say there is a God and he is unique? The work starts now. We've established the principle that we need to contemplate. Okay, let's start contemplating. Each at his own level. But that's the purpose of Shabbat, to call our attention to that which we need to contemplate. That's the Rambam's approach. So let's stop here. And Yetzer Hashem will pick it up next week. And hopefully the week after, Yetzer Hashem will be back in Shul, I hope.
Nachum?
Yes, I'm listening. Please talk.
Yeah. Is the implication of this that the reason why Kavanah is so important is that the purpose of the mitzvah is to perpetuate the understanding and the belief and not its intrinsic value in itself? And if you're not performing it consciously, you're not helping to perpetuate the underlying axiom.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little more next week. But yeah, the short answer, absolutely. And that creates a problem because in the Rambam system, in effect, what we're saying is if you perform your mitzvot mindlessly, you, as my father reminded me after last week's shiur, as Rav Soloveitchik said, you've got the Maaseh mitzvah, but without the Kiyum mitzvah. So in the case of you took a lulav, we're not going to make you go back and make the bracha again if you didn't have any thoughts to it. Because you were mekayem the Maaseh mitzvah. But that which you could have gotten out of the mitzvah by having the proper thoughts, you most certainly didn't. So in the terms of Shabbat, as you said, if you merely refrain from Shabbat, from doing Melacha on Shabbat, and even if you say Kiddush and some tefillot, but you don't think about what it means to have kept Shabbat and why you're keeping Shabbat, you really missed the whole point. Absolutely. You really summed it up beautifully. And yeah, that's a real problem. And that's why I think what we want to talk about next week is so important, because if we don't get what the Rambam is trying to tell us about the Tamei mitzvot, we're basically, in the Rambam's words, never having properly kept the mitzvot. And if you want a practical application to this, near the end of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam actually writes that someone who has kept one mitzvah, he actually goes, one mitzvah, any one mitzvah, take your choice, and performed it properly, he is a ben olam haba. But someone who has never performed a mitzvah properly is not a ben olam haba. And it doesn't matter why. He may have had all sorts of wonderful intentions, but if he didn't do it right, he's not a ben olam haba. And David, I think what you've pointed out is that for so many of us, the performance of mitzvot becomes about doing something. And it's quite clear to me when the Rambam said perform a mitzvah properly, he meant properly on the intellectual level, not simply the act of the mitzvah. So what you said is perhaps even more important than what you intended, but I suspect you intended it. Questions? No questions. Okay.
Shkaya.
Okay, let's go home.
Go home.